classifications of endangerment. First is critically endangered, meaning that the species has a 50% chance or greater of going extinct within 10 years or 3 generations. Second of all is endangered, meaning the species has a 20% chance of going extinct within 20 years or 5 generations. And third is vulnerable, meaning the species only has a 10% chance of going extinct within 100 years. There's also near threatened and lesser concern. There's also different ways we can talk about extinction. Extinction means that no animals of the species exist, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. Sometimes we think a species is extinct only to find an individual of that species in some remote place in the world many years later. A good example is the coelacanth, which is a prehistoric fish thought to have been extinct for 65 million years. And then in the 1980s, fishermen off the coast of Africa actually caught a coelacanth. So a lot of times what we think to be extinct turns out not to be extinct. This happens quite often actually, but a lot of times we can't confirm the sightings of scientists. Therefore, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature defines extinction as having no sightings of a species for 50 years. So if we don't see one for 50 years, we can say that it's extinct. There's also different classifications of being extinct. We can talk about a species being extinct in the wild, meaning that no individuals of that species exist anywhere in its natural habitat. Individuals of that species that are alive are housed in places like this, in the zoos, or they're kept as pets somewhere around the world. We can also talk about species being locally extinct, meaning that they're no longer living in some of their natural habitats, but they're still living in others. For example, the American wolf is locally extinct in the Adirondack Mountains, though it still exists in other parts of the United States. Finally, there's an informal term called ecologically extinct, which is sometimes used by scientists to refer to a species that is so few in numbers that it no longer plays its ecological role in its habitat. But it's important to remember that extinction is natural. In fact, mass extinctions are even natural. There's something called the background extinction rate, which is to say the rate at which species will go extinct without human intervention. And this statistic is influenced by things like competition and natural selection. Mass extinctions are also natural. There have been 5 mass extinction events in the history of the Earth, and a mass extinction is defined as 40% of the species on the planet going extinct within a short geological time frame. Now we're talking massive geological time frames here. So in 10 million years, if 40% of the species on planet Earth is extinct, that's considered a mass extinction. These mass extinction events are usually caused by some kind of shock to the global system. The latest one was at the end of the Cretaceous period, which ended the reign of the dinosaurs. Today's extinction rate, though, is anywhere between 100 and 1,000 times the natural background extinction rate. A lot of scientists believe that we're actually in the middle of the 6th great extinction event of planet Earth. And this is the first mass extinction event that has been believed to be caused by the actions of a single species, namely humans. Some of the ways that we contribute to this mass extinction event are fueling climate change, habitat reduction, and overhunting. We also fragment habitat, which makes it much more difficult for species to survive. The loss of biodiversity also results in a loss of genetic variation, which means that species are a lot less adaptable, and they're much more susceptible to disease and inbreeding. This is the issue that faces the cheetahs. A very small genetic pool means that they're highly susceptible to diseases. So why should humans care about biodiversity and endangered species? Well, think of an ecosystem like the game Jenga or tumbling towers. If one stack of Jenga blocks represents one ecosystem, and each individual block represents a species in that ecosystem, then we can imagine how the ecosystem is predicated on biodiversity. So if we take out the first 2, 3, maybe even 5 blocks, the structure still stands. But the more we take out, the more wobbly it gets, until you finally take out that last block and the entire system comes crumbling down. That's exactly what happens to ecosystems with the loss of biodiversity. Ecosystems provide a lot of services that humans depend on. They clean our air and water, they get rid of our waste, they provide us food and medicines, and they even provide us building material. We can't survive without biodiversity. The UN has actually calculated the economic value of all of these ecosystem services to humanity. And the UN estimates that the loss of biodiversity is costing the world economy $2 to $5 trillion every single year. And we don't even know of all the species that exist. Scientists think we may only have discovered about 10% of all of the species on planet Earth. About 18,500 species are discovered every single year. So the extinction rate very well might be many times larger than we think it is, because we're losing species before we even find them. Zoos play a really important role in preventing this loss of biodiversity. Zoos aren't just places to come and look at pretty animals. They're actually research facilities. They're primarily responsible for the formulation and execution of species survival plans. organizations that belong to the American Zoos and Aquarium Association work together to exchange animals, breed animals, and replenish wildlife. In the case of the cheetah, zoos are actually freezing egg and sperm cells, and then they're crossing the individuals that are least genetically alike in order to preserve as much genetic diversity in the species as possible. Zoos and organizations like the World Wildlife Fund often catch a lot of flack, though, for protecting only charismatic animals. In other words, the animals that are most cute and most cuddly. A lot of people don't believe that we should be spending so many $1 million a year trying to protect species that otherwise might go extinct without human intervention anyway. The counter-argument to this is that a lot of charismatic animals are also umbrella animals, meaning that by giving them protection, we're also providing protection to a lot of other animals that share their habitats. It's really difficult to stand on the corner of the street and hand out flyers that say protect the slug, but it's a lot easier to get people involved in protecting cuddly animals like elephants and dolphins and panda bears. So even though there might be species that are much more ecologically important, but are not necessarily as cuddly, by giving the charismatic animals protection, we ensure that the more ecologically important species that share their habitat get protected as well. That's all for lesson 1, so leave us your questions in the comments. For only protecting charismatic species.
Yo, are there some zebras going at it? Like seriously, is that what they're doing?